In this lesson, we're going to learn the three trig functions and how to use these trig functions to solve for sides in right triangles. So in the previous lesson, we learned how to identify the sides of a right triangle and labeling them the opposite, the adjacent, and the hypotenuse. In this lesson, and then we put them in ratios. In this lesson, we're going to learn the names to those ratios. So the three ratios we set up were opposite over hypotenuse, adjacent over hypotenuse, and opposite over adjacent. So today you're going to learn the names of each of those ratios. So the first one we're going to talk about is sine, and the sine ratio is the opposite side over the hypotenuse. So remember, trig is a relationship between angles and sides. And when we take the sine of a particular angle, it's equal to the opposite over the hypotenuse side. Okay, so the way you can think about it, sine is not a number, and we write it here as sin because that's how our calculator abbreviates it, but we say it as sine. You can think of sine as a function the same way the square root is a function. So square root isn't a number, it's something that you do to a number. It's the same thing with sine. Sine is not a number, it's something you do to a number. Okay, so sine, like I said, is the opposite over the hypotenuse, and if you can see, it's not on mine, but on the right hand side here when you fold your paper, you see SOH, so you pronounce that so, and that's a way to remember that it's opposite over hypotenuse. So sine is equal to the opposite over the hypotenuse side. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these examples. Okay, so I have a calculator here. I just have a screenshot of the iPhone calculator, and I have a screenshot of the calculators we have in class just so I can show you what buttons we're using. So sine, cosine, tangent, and the calculator that we're using are here. And in an iPhone calculator, they're right here. Okay, the way that you enter in these functions are different depending on the calculator. Most Android calculators work the same way as the calculators we have in class. That's why I only have a screenshot of an iPhone calculator. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the sine ratio. So as I said, the sine ratio is opposite over hypotenuse. Okay, and remember that sine is something you do to an angle. It's something that you do to a number. Okay, so when we ask for something that looks like this, where it says sine A equals, all they want us to do is this right here is our reference angle. Okay, so whatever they have right here, that's the reference angle. So this is telling us to use A as a reference angle and set up the sine ratio. So since sine is opposite over hypotenuse, we're going to set up the opposite over the hypotenuse. So just like we did the other day, I'm going to highlight my hypotenuse. Okay, and I'm going to label it H for hypotenuse. Okay, and then first thing I'm going to do is use A as my reference angle. So remember, like we talked about the other day, we're going to circle our reference angle. Okay, the opposite side to A is going to be the 6, and the hypotenuse is AC. So sine A is going to be 6 over 10. Okay, I do want you to reduce these fractions. So to reduce it, just think about what number can you divide the top and the bottom by. Well, since 2 goes into 6 and 2 goes into 10, to simplify, we can divide the top and the bottom by 2. So 6 divided by 2 is 3, and 10 divided by 2 is 5. So sine A is 3 over 5. Okay, so now we're going to do C. So we're using C as our reference angle, so I'm going to circle C. The opposite side to C is now 8, because remember, when we switch reference angles, our opposite and our adjacent sides switch. So using C as our reference angle, the opposite side is 8. So it's going to be 8 over 10, because our hypotenuse is 10. And just like we did before, to reduce the fraction, divide the top and the bottom by something in common. So I can divide the top and the bottom by 2, just like I could before. So this becomes 4/5. So sine of C is equal to 4/5. Okay, so how do we use that to solve for missing sides? Well, let's look at the example straight to the right. They're asking us to solve for x. So I do want you to still get in the habit, highlight your hypotenuse. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that for both triangles here. And we're going to circle our reference angle. Okay, and remember, the reference angle is any of the angles other than the right angle. Your right angle could never be your reference angle, so it's usually whatever angle is given to you. Okay, once you circle your reference angle, go ahead and label your side. So I know my highlighted side is my hypotenuse. When you see your reference angle, we say which means this side down here is A, and that means X is the opposite side. Okay, and then what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to highlight the information they give us. Well, the information we're given other than our reference angle is we're solving for X and we're given 17. There's nothing on the adjacent side that we care about. We're not solving for it and there's no measurement there. So here's how you can determine which trig function to use. Since the O and the H are the ones that are highlighted, that's how we know we're going to use sine. Because remember, sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So here's the O and here's the H, and then here's our angle. So the way you set these problems up is going to be the same for all of them. Okay, you're going to write your trig function, which in this case is going to be sine. Okay, then you're going to write your reference angle. Well, our reference angle is 31, so sine 31 equals, and then you're going to set it up opposite over hypotenuse. So it's going to be X over 17. So it's set up the same way as these problems over here. Your trig function, your reference angle, and then your ratio opposite over hypotenuse. So trig function, reference angle, opposite, hypotenuse. Okay, the way we're going to solve these is just using cross multiplication. So I put this over 1, and then we're just going to cross multiply. Well, X times 1 is X, and then 17 times sine of 31. Okay, I do want you to write the number first before you write sine. Okay, once you get here, then it's just a matter of just putting this in your calculator. Okay, so once you have X by itself, this is the part that gets put in your calculator. So looking at our calculators over here, okay, the way you're going to type it in is exactly how it says, 17 times sine of 31. So this isn't a real calculator, so it's not going to work, but you would type 17, and then you would press the sine button, and then you would just type in 31. Okay, if you are using an iPhone calculator, it's a little bit different. Okay, if you're using an iPhone calculator, you're still going to type in 17. So you would type in 17 times. With the iPhone calculator, you type in the degree first. So for this one, what was the degree? 31. So you would type in 17. So 17. And then you would write times. And then you would type in 31, hit sign. And then you would go ahead and hit the equal sign. Okay. So when you put this in your calculator, 17 times sine of 31, you should get that X is about 8.76. Okay, and we're just going to round to 2 numbers after the decimal. I'm just going to put in parentheses, put this in your calculator. So the highlighted part is the part that we're putting in our calculator. Okay, let's look at another example because each of these problems is a little bit different. Okay, so we've already circled our reference angle. What I'm going to do now is label my sides. So the highlighted side is my hypotenuse. When we see our reference angle, we say so that means this would be A, and that means 12 would be my opposite side. Okay, so again, I'm going to highlight what we're given. We're solving for X, which is the hypotenuse, and we're given the opposite side. So again, since we have an O and an H, that's how we know we're going to use sine. All right, set it up the same way you set up the previous problem. So it's going to be your trig function, which is sine, your reference angle, which is 69, and then you're going to do the opposite side over the hypotenuse. If you look at this problem is different because your variable is in the denominator. In the previous problem, your variable was in the numerator or on top. Okay, the way you solve these is similar. You still cross multiply, but you're going to see something. After we cross multiply, so I'm going to do X times sine of 69. Okay, I always want you to write the trig function last, and then equals 12 times 1, which is 12. So if you notice, after you cross multiply here, your variable is not by itself. So when we cross multiplied on the previous problem, x was by itself. In this one, we don't have x by itself yet. So to get x by itself, we have to get rid of the sine of 69. And remember, that's basically just a number. So we're going to divide both sides by sine of 69. Okay, that gets rid of that. So now we have x by itself. And the part that we're going to put in the calculator is this part right here. Okay, so looking at our calculators, okay, this is basically saying 12 divided by sine of 69. So using the big calculators, we just type in 12 divided by sine 69. What I like about these calculators is you can just type it in exactly how it is. When it's the iPhone calculator, remember you type in the angle before you hit the trig function. So using the iPhone calculator, we would do, let's see, what was it? 12. So you type in 12 divided by, since we're doing sine of 69, we would type in 69 first, hit sine, and then hit equals, and that should give you your answer. Okay, so when you put that in your calculator, you should get x is about 12.85. Okay, so what I'm going to write here that might help you remember how to set these problems up is on the front. Anytime you're doing a sine problem, you would write sine, parentheses, your angle, equals the opposite side over the hypotenuse. Okay, every problem is going to be set up that way. Okay, so now why don't you try a couple problems on your own. So go ahead and do problem number 1 and problem number 2. Okay, pause the video right here. Go ahead and try problem number 1 and number 2. Okay, so hopefully you did those two problems. Now I'm just going to go over how to do them. Okay, so first looking at problem number 1, start every problem the same way. I'm going to highlight my hypotenuse. I'm going to circle my reference angle, and I'm going to label my sides. So this is my hypotenuse, this is my adjacent side, this is my opposite. I like to highlight the information that we're solving for and the information that we're given, because this is going to help identify which trig function to use. Obviously, we're going to use sine for this one since I haven't taught you any other trig function. So we're solving for the hypotenuse, and we're given the opposite side. So we're going to set this up using sine. The way we set up the problem is you do the trig function, which is sine, then you do your reference angle, and then you do opposite over hypotenuse. Okay, then we cross multiply. So this is going to be x times sine of 24 equals 17. Okay, and if x is not by itself, you need to divide by sine of 24. So that gets rid of that. Then the part that we put in our calculator is this. We're going to put in 17 divided by sine of 24. And when you do that, you should get x is about 41.80. Okay, looking at the second example, I'm going to highlight my hypotenuse. I'm going to circle my reference angle, and I'm going to label my sides. So highlighted one is the hypotenuse. We see my reference angle, we say ah, and that means x has to be the opposite. So the information that we're solving for is we're solving for the opposite side, and we are given the hypotenuse. So since that's O and H, I know I'm going to use sine. So it's going to be trig function, reference angle, equals the opposite side over the hypotenuse. All right, there's the setup. To solve, we cross multiply. So x times 1 is x equals 18 times sine of 63. And since we have x by itself, we can go ahead and just put this part in our calculator, And when you do, you should get x is about 16.04. All right, so now let's go ahead and look at cosine. So the cosine ratio is set up a very similar way to sine, except the ratio is different. So instead of opposite over hypotenuse, it's adjacent over hypotenuse. All right, so let's go ahead and look at these examples here. Okay, so cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So the way we remember that, we say ca. So the first part is so, the second part is ca, C-A-H, cosine adjacent over hypotenuse. All right, so the problem's on the left-hand side asking us to do the same thing as before. I'm going to go ahead and highlight my hypotenuse. Okay, and for the first one, they want us to use A as our reference angle. So using A as our reference angle, the adjacent side to A is 16. So cosine of A is going to be 16 over 20. Okay, to simplify, the biggest number that goes into the top and the bottom is 4. So we divide the top and the bottom by 4, and you should get 4 over 5. Switching reference angles, now using C as our reference angle, the adjacent side to C is going to be 12, and the hypotenuse is 20. So it's going to be 12 over 20 using C as our reference angle. Divide the top and the bottom by 4, and you should get 3 over 5. So there are the ratios. Okay. So now how do we use it to solve for missing angles? Well, let's look at these examples. Okay, if you notice, every single problem I'm starting the same way. I'm highlighting my hypotenuse, I'm circling my reference angles, and I'm labeling my sides. Well, my highlighted part is H. My adjacent side is going to be 10, which means the blank side is the O. Okay, and I do like to highlight my given information. So I'm given 10, and I'm solving for the hypotenuse, which is x. Okay, so since I see that A and H are the ones highlighted, that's how I know it's cosine. Okay, if instead there had been a number on the O side, so instead, say if this 10 was over here on the O side, I wouldn't use cosine to solve it, I would use sine. Okay, but since 10 is the adjacent side and we're solving for the hypotenuse, that's the A and the H, so we know it's cosine. All right, so setting this up, it's trig function, which is cosine, reference angle, 65, equals adjacent over hypotenuse. Okay, from here, go ahead and cross multiply, so put it over 1. I always like to do the x first, so this is x times cosine of 65 equals 10 times 1, which is 10. So since x is not by itself, we still need to divide by cosine of 65 to get x by itself. Okay, these cancel each other out. So the part that we're going to put in our calculator is this part right here, 10 divided by cosine 65. Okay, so looking at our calculator here, remember the blue calculators that we have in class, you enter it the same way. You enter it the same way it looks right here, 10 divided by cosine 65. So you do 10 divided by cosine, make sure you hit cosine, 65. And then you would close your parentheses, hit enter, and you should get your result. An iPhone calculator, it's a little bit different. Okay, so you would do 10 divided by, and remember you do the reference angle first. So you do 65, and then you would hit cosine, and then you hit equals. All right, so when you put that in your calculator, you should get x is about 23.66. All right, let's look at the second example here. Start by highlighting my hypotenuse, circling my reference angle, and labeling my sides. So my highlighted is my hypotenuse, x is my adjacent, the blank side is opposite. Okay, we're solving for the adjacent side and we're given the hypotenuse. That's how we know we're going to use cosine. Okay, so setting this one up, it's the trig function, which is cosine, reference angle 46, equals the adjacent over the hypotenuse. All right, from here, cross multiply. So x times 1 is x, and then it's going to be 13 times cosine of 46. All right, since we have x by itself, this is the part that we're just going to put in our calculator, 13 times cosine of 46. And when you put that in your calculator, you get x is about 9.03. All right. So now go ahead and go over to the practice problems. Okay, and pause the video, go ahead and try number 3 and number 4. All right, going over number 3, I'm going to highlight my hypotenuse, circle my reference angle, and label my sides. Okay, since we're talking about cosine, this one's obviously going to be cosine, but if you see, we're solving for the adjacent side and we're given the hypotenuse. Okay, so there's the A and the H, that's how we know it's cosine. So setting this one up, it's going to be cosine, reference angle, which is 59, equals the adjacent over the hypotenuse. All right, cross multiply. So x times 1 is x, and then equals 12 times cosine of 59. All right, we have x by itself. So since x is by itself, this is what we're going to put in our calculator. And when you do, you should get that x is about 6.18. All right, looking at number 4, highlight my hypotenuse. And I'm going to circle my reference angle, and I'm going to label my sides. So highlighted is hypotenuse, x is my adjacent, and the blank side is my opposite. We're solving for the adjacent, and we're given the hypotenuse, which means we are going to be using cosine. So this is going to be cosine 16 equals adjacent over hypotenuse, so x over 12. Cross multiply. So x equals 12 times cosine of 16. Okay, since we have x by itself already, this is what we're going to go ahead and put in our calculator. 12 times cosine of 16. And when you put that in your calculator, you should get x is about 11.54. Okay, so now let's go ahead and go over tangent. Okay, well actually let me go to the front here. So cosine, set up similar to the previous one, but cosine, we're going to do cosine of your angle equals the adjacent side over the hypotenuse. Okay, so looking at tangent, so tangent is abbreviated by just tan. Okay, set up similarly to the previous ones, but with tangent, the ratio is different. So tangent, when we set these ones up, it's going to be tan of your angle equals, tan is opposite over adjacent. So we say TOA. So sine is so, cosine is ka, and tan is TOA. That's why we say SOHCAHTOA. All right, so let's look at the examples here for tangent. Okay, so the problems on the left are the same ones as before. All they're asking us to do here is just set up our ratios using a particular angle as our reference angle. So first, using angle A as our reference angle. Okay, 15 is the opposite side and 20 is my adjacent, so it's going to be 15 over 20. To simplify, 5 goes into both, so divide both the top and the bottom by 5, so you should get 3 over 4. And now we're going to switch to using C as our reference angle. Well, when we switch reference angles, the adjacent side becomes the opposite and the opposite becomes the adjacent. They just switch places. So this is just going to be the opposite of A. It's going to be 20 over 15. Simplify, reducing by 5, so you should get 4 over 3. Okay, so now using tangent to actually solve for missing sides, highlight your hypotenuse, circle the reference angle, and label your sides. So first sides I always label are my hypotenuse and my adjacent side, and then the one left over is the opposite side. All right, so for this one, we're given the opposite side and we're solving for the adjacent. So that's where the O and the A come from. Opposite and adjacent. That's how we know to use tan rather than say cosine or sine. All right, so we're going to use tan, and then it's going to be our reference angle. 27 equals 11 over x. And just like with all the previous ones, we're going to cross multiply. Okay, I always start with my x. So x times tan of 27 and 11 times 1, which is just 11. Since x is not by itself, we got to divide by tan of 27. So now we have x by itself. The part that we put in our calculator is this part right here. Okay, it's just going to be 11 divided by tan of 27. Or if you're using an iPhone calculator, 11 divided by 27 tan, and then hit equals. Okay, so when you do that, you should get x is, rounding to 2 decimals, you should get x equals about 21.59. All right, let's look at the second example here. So the second example, highlight the hypotenuse, circle the reference angle, and label the sides. Okay, so for this one, we are solving for the opposite side, and we are given the adjacent. That's how we know to use tan. So it's going to be tan 66 equals opposite over adjacent. It's going to be x over 20. Cross multiply, so starting with the x times 1 is just x. And then we have 20 times tan of 66. So since x is by itself, go ahead and just put this in your calculator. 20 times tan of 66. You should get, rounding to 2 decimals, x is about 44.92. And then you're done.